I'm going to be demonstrating how I painted the cover of the turtle on the Inktense block tins. Hi, I'm Lisa, the artist behind Lachri Fine Art. I was the lucky artist that Derwent chose to paint their new Inktense tins. This week I'm going to be demonstrating how I painted the turtle for the Inktense blocks. Normally I mix blocks and pencils. In today's video I'm going to show you how you can complete a full painting just using the blocks. If you are supporters over on Patreon, make sure to head over where the 2-hour version of this tutorial is available for you now, complete with voiceover. If you are unfamiliar with Patreon, for as little as $4 a month, you get access to all of my 1 to 2 hour long weekly tutorials, including all of my past videos. So that's over 100 there. It's a lot of videos for $4. If you want more information on Patreon, I will have a link below in the video description. Now let's move on to this demonstration. For this one, I have started by drawing everything out with a water-soluble graphite pencil. The reason that I use water-soluble is that way my pencil lines don't ever show through my painting. So once I add water, they're gone, which for me is important. I do not like the look of pencil lines showing through. What I'm doing here, I've made an ink mixture by mixing the brown from one of my blocks in with a lot of water. And now I'm using my liner brush. This is a synthetic hog-haired liner brush, and I am lining out all of my shapes. And I can adjust all of this later on. If it's a bit harsh right now, my lines are too harsh, it really doesn't matter. I can tone everything down later on. One of the things that I like so much about Inktense is that it is very, very forgiving. So if I decide I don't like a color that I used or I didn't draw something right, I'm just going to make an ink mixture with the white, paint that over the area that I want to cover up, and then I can paint on top of that. So if you do mess something up, it's not really a big deal. Very, very easy to fix mistakes with this medium. Adding some detail in here, and you can see on the finished painting, you're not going to have this much of the detailing showing. I want to have the hint of coral in the background, but I'm going to tone this down a lot. The detail that you're seeing here will just subtly peek through the layers that I'm going to paint on top. And a lot of this is just experiment. I don't have reference photos that I used for this for the coral. I'm just kind of making stuff up as I go along, to be honest. I've painted so many different corals in the past that this is one subject I don't have to have the perfect reference photo to get that same feel of coral. But if you've never painted coral before, I do recommend get some reference photos to look at to give you a good idea of what that coral looks like, how it clumps together, different colors, the way that they're shaded, and all of that. So continuing to lay out all of my basic shapes here. I'm going to fill the turtle in with this color as well. So by painting everything in with this brown tone, it just makes it very easy. I've got all of my details there, and I'm going to be able to glaze all of the color that I want on top of this. That way I don't lose any pencil lines. When I draw with a pencil, I can erase. I can fix stuff if I realize, oh, I think this eye's too big, too small. I can erase it and move it over. No big deal. But once I start with the ink, this is permanent. I can't move that. If I need to reform something, then I've got to make that white ink mixture I was talking about before and cover it up and then paint it again. So it's a lot easier just to use a graphite pencil to make any changes I need to where I'm going to need to erase before I start painting things in. Now when I'm painting in here, I want it to stay permanent. I don't want it to move around. So when I do those glazes, this will all stay put. That's one of the big differences between Inktense and watercolor. Watercolor pencils, they're watercolor. They'll lift up as you add layers on top. With the Inktense, they're permanent. So I can put this layer down, and as I put additional layers over it, this is not going to lift. This will stay put. So I can do a lot of glazing in a very similar way to how I would with acrylic painting. Now, all of these here you can see on the finished painting. I'll add highlights and such over it. That's okay. This just blocks it in. This actually by itself looks very, very nice with the teal colors that I'm using here and the brown. I think that would make for a really pretty painting. So I'm pretty sure I'm going to end up doing something like that in the future. I love this color combination. I'm just painting the water surface here, getting that movement of the water. And all of this is really being done at this stage with the same color of teal. Just the lighter areas I've added more water to make them more translucent. So if your color's too dark, just add more water to it. This area here I want to be darker, and then I'll fade that out so that it's lighter when I get down to the sand. I'm going to create the sections here so that it looks like I've got water, the water surface reflecting on the ocean floor. And I'll add white highlights in there later. Once that dried, I was able to put a wash of that same color, but a lot more water, so that it was a lighter tone over everything. I let that dry, and then I can come back and add additional detail. And I usually use the hair dryer to dry things, and it helps my paper to form back into its original shape if it starts to warp a little. That's also why I've got it taped down along the edges. That also adds to helping the paper hold its shape when it dries. I can just keep building up, making the colors darker and darker as I go. It's easy to build up. If you feel like your color looks a little dull, it's not as bright as you want, just add more layers until it comes out as bold and bright as you want it to be. The first few layers when you're using this, it's normal when you've mixed that ink mixture, especially if you've got a lot of water, it's very normal for that color to look dull. Just keep layering until it's as vivid as you want. And here's a good example of things that I completely changed. As I build up this color, looking at the finished painting, that is not at all what I left in most of these areas. The orange and greens, I really didn't end up liking, but it doesn't really matter. I can change that as I go. I'm just building texture that will show through future layers. And as I add these colors, there's no real rhyme or reason at this point. I'm just going to keep building until I come up with something that I like. My main goal here is to create texture. Getting some of that blue, adding a lot of that blue and teal because I want to make sure that this feels like it's in the water, and that's going to be my challenge, especially towards the back coral, the coral on the farthest left. I need it to look like it's farther away, so I'm going to have to add a lot more teal over those colors. Right now, that kind of purplish brown and olive green, that's not working. That's too warm, and it makes it feel like it's too close to the viewer where it should look farther away. So I let that dry, the mess that I currently have, and added another layer, adding some more of the darker colors for the water, like I was mentioning a minute ago, about just keep layering and layering until you get the color as bold as you want. I'm also adding some white in there to get some highlights. Some of the white I'm adding from the block straight to the paper, and some of it I'm making an ink mixture and painting that on. Now, anywhere where I make an ink mixture where I mix white in with the white block and then paint that on the paper, that's going to be much, much more opaque than if I just take the block, add that to the paper, and then add water. That's going to be much, much more translucent. Now I'm blocking in my first layer of color on some of these fish. Notice that my edges on these fish, not very clean right now. That's okay, I can clean those up later. I've got some blue and some orange mixed in there. I'm going to start working on the shadows of the coral. I'm just going to keep building and layering until I like how it looks. I'm adding some of these dark areas with the block directly onto the paper. And then I'll blend that out with the paintbrush. You have to be careful because when you add the block directly to the paper, or if you're working with the pencils, it's the same thing. When you add it to the paper and then add water, it ends up being way darker, way more bold than you might expect. So be aware of that. But it gave me a really nice bold shadow there that I needed. And that's going to be darker than just making the ink mixture and painting it on. I'm going to come through and start adding some highlights. This is with the white ink mixture. So I've added some white with my white Inktense block, and then I'm just painting that in. And you can see now I'm getting the highlights on some of these corals. So where I lost some of the detail, I'm able to pull some of those back in now. Some of these are going to be dots and some are actual lines. Sometimes I'm pushing harder on the brush to get thicker lines, and then sometimes just barely letting the tip of the brush touch so that I get the tiny details. But I want to get variation. I don't want to use the same amount of pressure everywhere, make the same kind of brush stroke everywhere, or it looks too uniform. I really need to get some variation in here. Now I let that dry completely before I start painting color on top. Otherwise things just start smudging together, and that's not what I want here. Coming back through with even more of my dark colors, a lot of magenta, and I'm putting a lot of the magenta and blue over the area where I had previously done the black shadow. That creates more depth than leaving black, straight black. I'll add blue to that as well later on. I'm just going to keep layering a little bit more detail and a little bit more detail. This again is with the white. I let that dry and I'm adding more color, added some of that magenta. Now I'm back to the white. That is one of my favorite colors, or I shouldn't even say favorite. It is my most used color in the Inktense. If you are getting a set of Inktense, I know Jerry's Artorama, Dick Blick, some websites will sell the Inktense individual colors. Always get extra of the white. That is the color I go through the most. I bought a whole huge pack of those a while back. It lasts a fairly long time, but when I compare how much I use all of my colors, the white is the one that by far I go through the fastest. And see, as I keep layering just a little bit more detail, a little bit more detail, and now you can really start seeing this texture coming through. Some squiggles, some lines, get variation. And if you have a bad layer, don't stress out about it. Just either paint it white so that you can paint color on top, or paint a darker color over that. So I'm starting with some of the teal on the turtle. And I want him to be very colorful, very, very bold. I really wanted to show in this piece the beautiful colors that you can make with these blocks. Now right now that's pretty muddy, the way the orange and the magentas are all mixing together with the blue. I've got a very muddy color, so I'm going to have to make that much more bold as I continue to layer. Now it looks like I'm just painting wet paint on top of wet paint. I'm not. Some of these areas I'm letting it dry before I add additional paint, because otherwise I'm just going to end up with mud. And I either let it air dry or take the hairdryer to it. Making some of these spots a little bit more bold. Most of those I'm adding blue over the brown. And the blocks are just so versatile because depending on the type of brush you're using, you can get thin lines, thick lines. You've just got so many options there, and you don't need really expensive brushes. Most of the brushes that I use are cheap, some kind of generic that I found a set at the art store, just tack-on bristled brushes. So right now that turtle is really dark, definitely very muddy. So I'm coming back through with some white and adding highlights. Got that highlight along the fin. I just took that white and went right along the side of the fin, and see how that gets more and more opaque as it dries. When you first put the white ink mixture on the paper, it'll feel like it's very translucent, like it's not covering anything. As it dries, it gets really opaque. Look how everything just got really, really light. It was just too muddy, and so I needed to clean that up, and I covered up most of that mud that I previously created. I didn't mess anything up or ruin it. I'm just going to try it again and make the colors a lot brighter than what I previously had. I've got that shell a lot darker towards the back, and then letting it get a lot brighter as it moves towards the turtle's face. Still working with the white highlights. Need some shadows in there now. I'm using a lot of blue. I may have a little bit of black mixed in with that. I painted this about a year ago, so I don't completely remember, in all honesty. But yeah, that looks like blue and black mixed together. And these paints, or the blocks, if you only have a small set, let's say you got a set of 12 just to try out, you can mix so many colors from that. These mix so easily and so well. So if you're not sure if it's something that you like, you may want to just try a small set, and you really can get a very good feel for the medium with the smaller set. I'll warn you, if you do anything like I did, I started with a 12 set that came in my Smart Art box. I loved them and was really excited to get the full set. But you can do a whole lot with the smaller sets. And continuing to build, I'm starting to build more clumps and clusters in these corals. It's very similar to how I would paint bushes or trees, where I don't want everything to look flat, so I've got to make it look like clumps and clusters. Some are sticking out further than others, which basically means I need shadows in between some of these clumps and clusters. Dried that. I'm going to go ahead and add more of those shadows in between these clumps. Technical term there. Going to darken this outside edge even more. And I'll still have to come through and get a lot of highlights. Starting to brighten up the turtle now. I want a lot of oranges in him. And one thing that I did on this one that you don't typically see me do, and you'll see this at the end, I actually, for my final details, took the blocks and added them right on top of the paper. Usually I make my ink mixture and paint it, but adding it directly to the paper for those final layers gave me these bold, beautiful, almost glowing orange colors. That's how I'm going to get most of the orange on the turtle. To get them really bold, I just pushed fairly hard on the block and applied them. Now the blocks are fairly brittle, so if you're using one and it breaks, don't feel like you ruined anything. I typically intentionally will break mine into pieces, maybe into the size of a third or a half of what they come full, and work with them that way. So if you do break yours, don't feel like anything's ruined. I prefer them actually broken into pieces. Cleaning up edges now. I want to have a nice clean edge around the turtle shell and that outer fin, or front fin. Still building up those shadows. This I'm using some purple and blue. It looks like it's black, but it actually has this purpley blue color to it. Purpley blue, another technical term for you there. Now I'm using white to pull highlights, and I'm doing a lot of dots because I want to create that texture, that rough texture of coral there. So I can dot in my highlights, and that both gives me highlights and texture at the same time. And look how nicely that stands out as it starts to dry and that color gets very opaque. I'm going to add some detailed branches back here. Remember with these brushes, the harder you push, the thicker your line is going to be. If you want a very thin line, just barely let the tip of those bristles touch your paper. And with these little branches that I'm painting in there, I can take another color and glaze over it. But I'm going to paint them in white first, just so that that other color will show up. Let's say I wanted them to be bright orange. If I just paint the orange on top of the dark purple, it's not going to show up. Orange is too translucent. So if I want to have a color show up, like with these fish are going to be oranges and blues, but if I painted just orange and blue over the color that's already there, it would be too translucent. You wouldn't see the fish. It would just kind of darken or muddy up the color underneath. So by painting the white first, just like those branches, I can let that dry and then put any color I want on top of it. I could use bright yellow, which is really translucent, but I've got this opaque white underneath, so it'll really pop out still. So anytime you decide you want to add a bright color on top of a dark color, that's where that white comes in handy. And with that, I definitely prefer to make my ink mixture versus taking the white directly on the paper. It doesn't work really well if you do it that route. Going to start defining a lot better these areas on his fin. I don't want them to all be one solid color because that'll look flat. I want to make the plates on his shell and the sections on his fin, I want these to fade from light to dark. Now here's where I started using the block directly on the paper. Look how it's a deep magenta, but that just glows. It looks so pretty up against all of the other colors that I blended. And I can blend some out with white, or with water, I can't talk. I can blend some with water, or I can let it set exactly like it is. You don't have to always blend everything with water. It just depends on the look that you're going for. Getting some more shadows, just going to keep building until I get those dark enough. Really focusing to make sure that edge of that fin stands out. So in order for that to stand out, I need what's next to it to be really dark. I'm working on the shadows in those clumps and clusters I was talking about earlier on these corals. Going to tone down the highlights in the back here. I want those to just kind of fade out into the distance. So I'm adding that same teal color that I used on the water. I'm adding that over some of these highlights in the coral that I want to look farther away. And that helps it to feel like it's in the water and not just cut out from something else and stuck on this. I'm pulling that same color into the coral in the foreground as well. Not everywhere, not as strong as what I did in the back. Few more highlights with the white. See, I can just keep coming back to it as many times as I want. So anytime you have a layer, don't be afraid to try different things. Don't be afraid to make mistakes, because even if I do, if I went too dark somewhere, no big deal. I'm just going to take the white, add more of that, and then I can add whatever color I want on top. So adding orange to these little fish I painted white earlier. And with that liner brush, I can get really tiny, tiny fine details. And adding that teal color that I used for the water, I'm adding that over a lot of the white that I added the last layer through with on the turtle. And see how, especially the back end of that turtle, how it just makes that, you can see the shape of the turtle, but I want it to look like it's farther away. I don't want it up in your face. So just by toning that white down, I get almost a glow. Some last details in here, darkening up portions of the water even more. You can see other areas where I added even more white on the shell of the turtle, where I decided, you know, still a little too dull. So I added more of that white ink mixture. You never really get to a point where the water can't take more, or not the water, the paper can't take more. You'll be able to layer as much as you want. It's not like working with colored pencil where you hit a point where your paper just will not take more layers. You don't really have that happen here. Not when you're painting like I am here with a brush, because I'm not damaging the tooth of the paper at all. Added some purple in here. Some of this too dark. I'll have to lighten it up again. Taking the block and adding some detail there. The orange, this color, I just loved how this stood out against all of my purples and the dark colors. Look how bright that looks on the turtle, much more so than when I was just trying to paint it on. This really made a difference, taking those blocks and using them just for the final layers. I don't like the blocks for the first layers because you tend to get a very gritty, grainy look with them, but for these final layers, they were perfect. They added a little bit of texture to the feel of the coral especially, and then that color is just pops. It is so, so bright. And there is my finished painting. Very, very different than those earlier layers. Remember, anytime you're painting or drawing, especially with paint or ink in this case, if you have a bad layer, don't give up. Don't be frustrated. All that means is that you're not finished yet. Did any of you guys end up getting these blocks or the pencils, the tin with the dolphin on them from last week? If you pick any of these up, I would love if you shared a photo with me on any of the social media platforms. I've got links to all of mine below in the video description. I'm really excited that I got to put all of my years and years and years of experience of only painting marine life into this project. I love you, Inktense box. I'm so excited about this. He sleeps with me. He has his own blanket. Okay, I'm done being weird. Hey, have you subscribed yet? If not, I have a handy button right there. It's round, has an orange arrow going to it. Can't miss it. If you click on that, that'll help you to keep up to date with all of my new art videos every single week.